wait for it to come online, and apparently we are live. So welcome YouTube. Hey everybody, how's it going today? We are going to have a fun session. This is going to be a nice, intimate one. We're going to keep it small. We get a couple of guests. We've got room for a couple more guests if you want to come join us and have us work on some of your sessions, or some of your experiments. But basically, what we're doing today is we built this process built around design thinking, and I'll let Lavinia and Patricia and Rebecca fill you in on the details. But basically, it's a method for crafting experiments so that you can actually use your Outbound to learn scientifically. And I know we're all running tests, and we're split testing and A/B testing. This is just going to walk you through a methodology of, based on some design thinking principles to get you going maybe a little bit more, maybe think a little bit outside the box, or maybe help you hone in a little bit deeper. And this is based on, we've run this, I don't know how many, a couple hundred experiments so far, and it's the basis of our Outbound labs. And so if you are running experiments, if you're thinking about running experiments, this is where you need to be. If you've got experiments that you want to check out, join us in the chat, say hello. But while I'm doing the introductions, just throw in the chat, let me know where you're from, where are you listening from today. And so on my left, although my screen might be flipped, so on my left, I've got Patricia Sims. She is messaging extraordinaire here at Predictable Revenue. We also refer to as an account strategist. And essentially, she's in charge of making sure clients are getting all the meetings that they need. And so that can range from writing messaging, building lists, building experiments, and actually working on objections. So hello, Patricia.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Thanks for joining us. And then to the middle and below, we have Lavinia, but I like to refer to her as Rebecca Hicks, just to give her a tough time. And Lavinia was an account strategist until they kicked her out of the group. But now she runs our head of product innovation here at Predictable Revenue. She also ran the Outbound Labs program for us. Oh, this is funny. I can actually see myself in the YouTube, so I'm going to pause that. That's weird. So Lavinia ran Outbound Labs for us in, for basically all of them since we started doing it. And she's been on some of the videos, so you might recognize her from some of those videos. But say hello, Lavinia Rebecca Hicks.
Hi guys, thanks for joining us. Really excited to get in and kind of workshop this and get a few experiments live and talking about how everyone can replicate what we've been doing internally.
Beautiful. We got Nicaragua on here. We got Argentina. We got Poland, Spain. It's beautiful. Quite the collection. All right, so Lavinia, I know you've got a couple of things that you want to share with us before we jump in, and we've got somebody live on the line. And so Peter will be bringing you in just a few minutes here. But Lavinia and Patricia, why don't you run us through what we're going to be looking at today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I shall start by sharing my screen. Bear with me if you give me 2 moments. I'm always going to just take that extra moment and the bear with me to make sure that I'm sharing the right thing.
Yeah, hide all the illicit.
We don't need
folders.
your bank details today. That's not what we're looking at today.
We are going to go for
Santa Fe, New Mexico. Right on.
Nice.
How's that?
That looks great.
Beautiful. Fab. So yeah, as kind of was saying, we are going to be going through kind of how we run the process internally. And then also I'm putting on Peter, who we have on the line as well, just to put some of this kind of theory into practice, because it's all very good and well talking about how we run these experiments and all the ideas behind it and the approach to take. But it would be great also just to workshop that and put that into something tangible and real that we can actually get some results at in the next few weeks after run those experiments. Fab. So I'm going to jump in, kind of start talking about how we run the process, or how we have run it for the last, must have been kind of 18 months plus here internally. And just to give you an idea of where to start. So I think one of the biggest things and one of the biggest questions we have is what should I test? There's always so many different topics or something that's like topical at the time. And it's really difficult to know kind of where to start. Like subject lines, popular on channel, value prop, CTA, like there's a whole plethora of different areas we can test. I mean, Patricia, I know from like running the AS team, is always feels like every week there's something different. There's a different area, there's a different idea, there's a different like method or area that people are kind of wanting to find out whether it works or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's always something to innovate with and something to work off of, especially from the AS point of view. If you're talking to your clients and you're aware of what's happening with boots on the ground with them, there's always information that you can glean from that, for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also this is where Outbound Labs was really born from, the fact that there are always so many ideas, and everyone kind of goes and tests a few things, and then you kind of get an idea of the results or how it's going to work, but your confidence on whether it was the element that you changed gave you the results, not quite sure, kind of went in, changed that subject line to something I thought would work, and my results ticked up. Well, I don't know, then it's how high is my confidence that it was that subject line change that increased the results? Probably quite low, because I did a bit ad hoc, and there was like lots of this experimenting going on in the S team. We thought, because there's so much that we're trying and changing, like why don't we kind of like try and harness this all and make it into a form where we can be confident that, okay, yeah, this is what we changed, this is what the impact it had on the results. And then obviously that's great, because it means we can then replicate those changes across other campaigns, and hopefully see those same results. But obviously there's a lot there to graph, so we can actually know what is making the difference. So there you start, like what to test. So we follow a very design thinking led approach, and this is kind of like problem first. So we're really looking at kind of where we're starting point, rather than saying, oh, we want to test a subject line, we want to test this. Kind of, we start very much at the beginning, like really like top of funnel, high funnel, and then we get the group together, the AS team, and we talk about currently like what are our uncertainties, what do we not know, what problems are we currently facing. So I think, Peter, this would be a good chance to kind of mention your example. Is like you're looking to break into a new US market, so this is your like high level problem, right? That's a perfect example of like what problem are we trying to tackle. When we do it internally, because I was saying there's so many different things, we get all of the ASs together and we get everyone to individually write on a sticky note, as it was when we were all in the same office, and just write everything and say, okay, these are all the problems we're facing, like one on a sticky note, no limits. It can be the biggest, wildest problem, it can be really specific, doesn't matter. And then we kind of bring them all together, everyone shares the problems they've come up with, and then it's an element of, there's like no judgment, no comment, no going into it in detail, but everyone's kind of sharing. Trying to think of some of the examples that we come up with problems of. There were lots around LinkedIn when we started leveraging LinkedIn as a channel. Like, how do we increase connection rates? How do we adapt our CTAs to those kind of channels? They were definitely popular ones.
And we had snacks. Let's be honest, that was part of the brainstorming.
Yeah, the food. That's what got everyone attending as well.
Lunch and learns.
Yeah. So then we filter down from that problem space, and then we all do a voting exercise. So naturally, some people are going to come up with very similar problems. So we cluster them into groups, and then ask everyone to vote on the specific problem they'd like to focus on. And this is really how we get that focus. And I think that focus is really important to this process, because without the focus, the rest of the experiment, you can kind of think you're testing one thing, go a different direction, be distracted. But having that ultimate focus allows you to get to the end of the experiment and say, yes or no, this did not work, and I think this is why. So starting with that focus, kind of funneling it down. Then we would go into the process of kind of how can we test, what solutions can we try and test and experiment with to try and solve this problem. So again, Peter, looking at solving problem around kind of breaking into a new market, breaking into the US market. And you'd like to specifically try and test different subject lines, and also channels. So there too, we can like dig into those and kind of design experiments around those. And that's like a really good example again of like the solution. So we want to be thinking of problem first, breaking into the new market. So like, how can we test and find solutions for breaking into a new market and booking meetings in a new market that we can test subject lines or subject lines, that what channel is most effective in the US market. So that's the next stage. Then again, vote. There are going to be loads of different ideas when we're doing this, like if you're doing this in a group setting. And at this point, this is where it's really good to have a bit of a conversation. Get people like talking about it, thinking about critically analyzing other people's ideas, their own ideas, thinking about potential challenges, risks. I think this is the bit where you can really get a good bit of conversation going, and then you can really focus on that specific test or experiment that's going to help you solve that problem. So I think that's always really crucial. Think of, there are times when obviously this brainstorming exercise, this big like blue sky thinking, everything, it's easy to go off track a bit. But I think as long as you keep coming back to it, like further down the process and thinking, okay, my experiment or this test links back to helping me solve this problem, then you'll be perfectly on track, staying on that, keeping that focus that started talking about at the beginning. And so then the next stage is this, is we get into the fun bit, the designing the experiment and then doing the experiment itself. So I think this is where, Peter, we can jump in and we can start looking at designing some experiments for your test that we want to get going. So I reckon what we can do is, if we hop forward a few slides, I actually have an example experiment doc template. Looks like a lot of words. Walk through it, break it down. A lot of them are just going to be like critically analyzing different stages, but this is how we internally like track our experiments. We do it step by step, and we kind of look at each element as a design. So we're going to start with, let's have a look. So, okay, like campaign details. So, Peter, we can either start with the subject line side or the channel side. Which one would you prefer to kind of pick off with?
Yeah, like, hello, I'm Peter from Y Cluster. And what I would start with definitely is channel thing, because that's one of the questions we were asking ourselves for quite a long time. As we are new to the US market, we would like to understand what are our options for foreigners, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the here what would really be top of mind is channel is the main variable we want to be testing. So if we start with what channels did you have in mind that you wanted to test? What was the area you wanted to go with?
Yeah, I mean, we were quite successful in the Czech Republic with using LinkedIn messaging and email campaigns. Email campaigns we use less because we found LinkedIn messaging much more relevant in this area. But definitely, I'm open to other suggestions.
Yeah, nice. I think doing a we could do an email experiment versus a LinkedIn experiment, and also almost have the email experiment as the control. So kind of have that as our baseline, and then we switch up the messaging. What do you think, Patricia, about kind of using that as control? Because they're both new, they're both some experience there.
Yeah, I would say where email has been a standard form of communication in this respect for longer, it's a good control because it's a bit more archaic in nature. So we have enough data, typically speaking, with open rates and whatnot, to kind of gauge the success of LinkedIn versus email. I think you're onto, yeah, that's the right way to go.
Yeah, perfect. So if we're going to do an email versus LinkedIn, so I'm going to bear with my flicking around. So here we are. So we have basically, we know what we're going to test. We're going to be changing the channel. So that's going to be the variable that we're changing. And now when we're designing these two campaigns, two experiments, we want to make sure that everything else is going to be like kept the same. So a key part of that is the list that's going to be built. So when we've done all of these internally, and we've made sure that the contact list we build is built as one, and then we literally split it in half. So Peter, I mean, when it comes to list building, kind of what size lists are you pulling? how you're putting them, then we can work out whether it's an easy matter of just kind of like splitting that list in half, how many contacts we'll have on each side. How are you currently list building, Peter? Then we can.
Sorry, I just missed you for a second. So yeah, we what we do, and we found very useful, at least in the Czech market, we followed a lot of influencers in the HR space and founders, and we follow their let's say LinkedIn discussions, and then we put their followers into our lists, and that was one of the most successful ways in the past how to build a list of potential leads.
Nice, perfect. I know that sounds very similar to we've tested some of that internally as well. Nice, yeah, it's definitely a good method when you've got that activity on LinkedIn.
To be very honest, I think I got this idea from you guys, so it's not invention.
It's circular, right? What goes around comes around. Is going back. And then kind of what kind of size lists were you building from that?
The size, yeah. So let's say initially we built a list of, I would say, 500 contacts at the very beginning, and yeah. So in terms of size, 500. And I believe, following your methodology in this site, I think they were pretty active and very targeted contacts, because they were interested in the same discussions we are trying to push our services to. So
yeah, I would just thinking about the two experiments. So obviously another really crucial part of setting up experiments is having a big enough sample size. Big enough sample size essentially leads to less chance of like a sampling error. And it comes to that like ultimate the end confidence in the results. Like, can we say these results are because of the variable we're changing, as opposed to that the selection of people that we put into the experiment and sent the campaign to, do they just behave in a particular way, and it's not actual an honest representation across the board. So I wonder with this approach, because I mean, Patricia, we know this is definitely a more time heavy consuming approach to building lists. It can be. How are you going about that? Do you think there's a way you could increase that sample size, like that list building method, to about 2,000 contacts, or would that be kind of a limit or a barrier at your end?
So on our side, I believe we can improve this, but definitely if you have any idea how to do it quicker, I'm open to it, because we have quite limited team. We don't have like people who are specialized in list building. So yeah, it consumes time from actual meetings with customers, etc. So I believe if there are any methods you tested and are faster than this quite manual way, I would like to hear them.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've with the influencers and posting campaigns, we've used some tools such as Phantom Buster. I know that's ones we've used in the past, and we've had lists of contacts, and we've kind of enriched the email data, and then able to build those lists within LinkedIn itself. I mean, Patricia, I know you've been working a lot on the LinkedIn campaign side of things. Are there other kind of like hacks or tips in list building at the moment in there?
There's a couple of strategies we use. We're lucky enough that we have a research team that knocks it out of the park for us, for sure. Definitely Sales Navigator can be a friend of yours, for sure. Depending on what data you have access to, there's ways. I find for me, reaching out to a client and saying, do you have for me, I would look at what you're saying and say, do you have a targeted list of accounts that would be the bang on? If you could sync a dream account, what would that look like? So when you're brainstorming with your team, if you can come up with a list of companies, say in the American market, that you're like, this would be a fantastic opportunity for us, it's a great way to at least remain targeted while trying to open the volume up as well. So being able to experiment with the type of roles that you're targeting also can help too. And that leads us into other parts of this conversation, but opening up the roles and the personas that you're targeting can also help with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also a perfect example of theory versus practice, right? So like in theory, we're trying to run an experiment that's like scientific, we're going to get reliable results. We're trying to control for all these kind of different errors and different factors that could come and influence our results. But ultimately, then we also have like the reality. And firstly, like we're dealing with humans at the end of the day. So that's going to be really difficult to control for. Like how you can't control for whether you end up reaching out to someone on a good day or a bad day. You can't control a whole plethora of other elements. And I think this is another perfect one. Like we want to try and focus and make this as scientific and as accurate so we can have that high confidence in results. But ultimately, if it becomes more of a burden or more of a barrier to get to, that list of 2,000 contacts versus 500, then these are the kind of compromises we have to make. But I think they're not bad compromises to make. I think it's just worth noting that, moving forward and when you get to the results, as long as you keep them in mind. So if we stick to, let's say, sample size of 500 to start with, split that in half, 250 contacts in each campaign, like that's definitely a great place to start. And I think also with these experiments, it's a good place to get kind of an indicator, because that's like what you're going to do when you come to the end and look at the results. Is there anything compelling coming from it? Are you starting to get a bit of a hint of a trend? If yes, okay, yeah, that's a good sign for you to like, maybe it is worth, adding more resources or putting more time into building that large list. But if it's going to become too much of a barrier at the beginning, like it's not always worth kind of worrying over that like one element. I think it's something that's like true that we've tried to do here is try and like keep experimenting like as simple as possible, as easy as possible, like hack together some kind of solution, make it kind of low tech, nothing too fancy, but just get something out so you can have a result that will lead you. Because ultimately, very conscious that obviously when we're testing, like the end goal is still meetings. We're still trying to book meetings, and that is also a time sensitive activity. So whilst it's great to say that we could be experimenting for as long as we want, looking what works and what doesn't work, and finding what doesn't work is just as valuable as finding what does work.
Yes. That's a big one.
So maybe a question here, like, do you have any recommendation for some kind of automation to get like contact details of those people on the list? Because what we found out, we do have quite a great like we define the target group of people we need to contact, but to get the details so that we can split the group in two pieces and start sending emails versus messaging via LinkedIn, we need a couple of different contacts for this.
Yeah, can I jump in there? In terms, because there's nothing great that automates, that's going to like fully automate this. Your best bet is people. Your best bet and your safest bet is people. There are good people on Upwork. I was thinking Elance, but it's now Upwork, that you can find to go through and do this if you do some Google searching. And there are tools like Lead IQ that I find are helpful for like making that process easier. And so, yeah, Lead IQ, if you check out any of the stuff Ryan O'Hara talks about, that's a faster way of pulling. It's sort of like it's not working on LinkedIn. It's sort of working alongside. There's nothing that's fully automated. LinkedIn will never allow that. And so what you'll need to do is build a process where you say, okay, I'm going to identify, this thread or that thread, and then I'm going to send it to my team. And as Lavinia alluded to earlier, that's how we've developed things here at Predictable Revenue, is because machines aren't going to get it right. And even if it was able to pull, like if you're connected to an individual on LinkedIn, you can see their email address. Not everybody uses their professional email address. So you're going to get a lot of like colin.stewart@gmail.coms, right? Which is not what you want. And so what you actually need is to use that data, and you need somebody that has that can look at it and say, okay, well, you know, this might be what they have in LinkedIn, but I'm going to go check in a couple other sources. And LeadIQ is a good source. ZoomInfo actually has a helpful plugin. If you have a ZoomInfo account, they've got a tool that I think it runs alongside LinkedIn or something along those lines, and you can click a button and see if ZoomInfo has that individual's contact information, and then you can push that into your Salesforce instance or push it into a list. I think there's even a company called eQuire. I don't know if they're still around. ECQUIRE. I'll fire a link, and yeah, it looks like they're here. They got a Chrome extension. Anyway, they basically let you sort of push. They do kind of the same thing, but they basically push first name, last name into a spreadsheet or into your CRM, but they don't enrich it and add. I don't know if they add contact info. So.
Okay.
Those are things I'd recommend. There's nothing that's really automated. It is a manual process, but you can find people on Elance or Upwork that are able to do that. And back to you, Lavinia. I'll shut up again.
No, that was great. Thank you. Good. Gives a lot more color and detail. Good to know about that, because I think that's a big thing as well. Like list building is such a crucial part, right? Like getting it right. That's a whole nother ball game. Like testing.
That's its own
It's a whole different thing we could go into as well. So yeah, on the list building side for the experiment, I think, yeah, crucial. However you go about building the list, by LinkedIn, kind of looking at posts, it's really crucial that list you come up with, you built in exactly the same way. And for the 2 experiments, you're literally just splitting down the middle. That way, it's not like you've been pulled from a different data provider, a different method, any of the above, so that then we know, okay, this is exactly the same list we've built. They're going to be different people. It comes back to that whole like human element. They're going to be different people, but we've done what's in our control to make sure it's like as similar as possible. That's one of the key elements of making sure both campaigns are controlled. The other variable that is really key to keep controlled is messaging. So, right, ultimately, if we're just testing what we really want to be testing is the channel, then we want to make sure that everything else is the same. Like when it comes to testing email messaging versus LinkedIn messaging, this is again a whole nother offshoot that it would be possible to test again, because obviously LinkedIn lends itself to a different style of messaging versus email. So that's something that within the channel itself, there's like loads of scope for testing the messaging, and whether you put a connection message with the request that you send, whether you don't, how many follow-ups you send, all of the above. I think the main thing here is to keep them as similar as possible. Again, this is the kind of one of the areas where you have to potentially make a bit of compromise. Like the messaging that you write, you want to keep the same, but it's going to kind of be optimized for one channel over the other. So I would say I would err on the side of optimizing on the messaging for the LinkedIn campaign, largely because I think on LinkedIn you have more limits with regards to like how many characters you can use in a connection message, and the impact of that first connection message over like an initial on an email campaign. But I think as long as they're the same, then that, like, we're controlling for that. Even if you feel it's slightly kind of LinkedIn focused messaging, you can still transcribe that into an email and test it. And then we are truly testing like which channel is like the most effective.
Regarding the messaging itself, or maybe subject lines, do you have any recommendation for these campaigns? Because, for example, here in Czech Republic, people are quite opposed to just accepting invitations from strangers. So, is there a way you recommend in the first place, either like because when you build such a quite a big list of 2,000 plus contacts, it's quite difficult to go really personalized, in terms like, hey, I read your article and I love it, and then we can connect. Is there a way or recommendation from your side? What is the best way to include a message and personalize it in a way that it seems that it's really personalized, but it's quite automated?
Sure. So I know we've had a lot of success internally with what we've referred to as like the knowledge share approach. And it's the approach where in the messaging, you focus on the area that the prospect is working in and how it's relevant to your offering and your value prop. So for an example, this might be a bit outdated now. So Patricia, you could probably jump in and give a bit more of an updated, like stance on this, but it's very much, hi Peter, I wanted to connect as I saw we share common ground when it comes to XYZ in the HR space. Would you be open to connecting and kind of discussing further? And then you have the opportunity to add color in the follow-up. I mean, Patricia, how's that all going at the moment on the LinkedIn side of things?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like we've seen the most success because it's typically a conversational platform with maintaining a conversational style of messaging. So we want to open that discussion. It involves sometimes a bit more nurture when it comes to how you handle these prospects, being open to conversation, answering questions, being able to give them some insight via the platform. A lot of people will then just, ask, can you just shoot me an email with some information? And then that leads you down that path of having their business email to connect with them. So ensuring that you're maintaining that conversational style and suggesting we really just want to share some ideas with you. And that helps you do some of the discovery on your own end as well to ensure that although in theory this prospect might be the ideal person you want to connect with, it opens a dialogue for how you qualify them moving forward. And it sets a stage for that relationship you build with them as well.
Thank you.
Nice, perfect. So yeah, I think on the controlling variable side of things, they're definitely the two big ones, like the messaging and the list building technique. There are also some others depending on how you'll be running the experiment. So for example, if you're using a platform like Outreach, making sure it's both of them are done on Outreach. If you have individuals sending messages at a certain time of day, try and make sure that like each campaign has emails sent at the same time of day, even if it's kind of a 50-50 split, like sending half of them at 9 a.m. EST and the other half at 2 p.m. EST. Just make sure there's like an even split between the two. And then we can just make sure, ultimately that there's the split between the even split. How are you currently sending out emails? Are you using a platform or to manage those campaigns, or are you kind of doing it more manually?
So yeah, as we are based in the Czech Republic, we are using tools for emailing automation, which are local here. So there is some Czech company providing smart emailing tools. So we used that. The good thing about it is that it looks like a normal email. It's not with any information that it's automated or it's marketing message. So that was great. But probably going outside of our local market, we will need to find out another tool. So yeah, I will definitely check Outreach. I heard about it before. So
nice, perfect, brilliant. Yeah, I think that they're the main parts on the kind of experiment design, getting them set up kind of in the main elements that we need to keep an eye out for. Again, the point here, like the control campaign, I think we decided the email campaign is going to be our control campaign, and then what we're changing is that channel to LinkedIn. I also got here like an important part of this kind of taking this experimental approach is that you create a hypothesis, because ultimately at the end of the test, end of the experiment, end of the campaigns, you want to see if you've proved or disproved the hypothesis. And this kind of comes back to the idea that we were talking about at the very beginning when we were talking about kind of like focus and making sure we have that really laser focus on what we're testing. This kind of helps us keep that focus as we're doing the experiment and we come to the conclusion as well. So when it comes to hypothesis, we want to make sure that we keep it directional. And then we also want to make sure that it has some kind of quantifiable objective measurement in it. So for example, it could be leveraging LinkedIn as a channel will result in a 50% more meetings booked than email as a channel. So I mean, Peter, what do we want to put this up? And also it can be like a method. It doesn't have to be like really thought over, really kind of like have a backstory or really think about how you come up with that number. But the key thing is like you can objectively then say yes or no, we've proven or disproven the hypothesis, and also that it's like, yeah, objective. So I mean, what for this one, what would you like to set as your hypothesis?
So as we started quite broad, like we would like to get to the US, would you suggest at the beginning to split this into like smaller or something more tangible? Because I feel myself that, you know, this is quite of a big goal. So are there any ideas you would use to split this big goal into smaller things or smaller parts? And then I believe building hypothesis is much better on these smaller parts, right?
Yeah. So if we think of the hypothesis based on this channel test, so you think of like, this is the hypothesis for the specific channel test. We can then also create a hypothesis for example, like localized campaigns. So it can be looking at, I think that in, I don't know, the East Coast or the West Coast, or then break it down that way. I think the crucial thing here with like this hypothesis, and like in the nature of like controlling all variables apart from the channel, the hypothesis could be like just on that, because we don't want to start changing like too many things, because as you're saying, we've got this huge like overarching header of like breaking into a new market, and so there are going to be loads of strings for that. So this is going to be one string, like channel, and then we're going to build a hypothesis for that, and then we can look at for example, like localized campaigns. So will I have more success with East Coast cities compared to West Coast cities? And then that can have its own hypothesis. And I think ultimately, like each of these different strands, when you like pull them together, then hopefully you'll be able to pull together a clearer picture of where the areas of opportunity do lie in the States. I think also it's a good, like I'll mention it like later on, but also that's a really good point about kind of like, what next? Okay, this is great, but like, what do I do next? So this could be a good opportunity. So if we're running one for where you're changing the channel, and then you're looking at localized, and then you're saying, okay, I found out that West Coast cities I have more success in. I want to kind of focus on West Coast cities now, but now I need to double that up with what channel is going to work best in West Coast cities. And you can kind of take the two, and you can build a list that is just companies or personas on the West Coast, and then do this again, saying, I think LinkedIn will have the best results. So you can tie them in and have the hypothesis that like, I think that leveraging LinkedIn as a channel for companies based on the West Coast will book me X more meetings than leveraging email. So there are lots of different complexities we can change, but I think this is one of the areas where it's so easy to kind of like get like carried away and excited about like all the different opportunities to test, right. which is so normal, which like we always do. We're like, oh, we can do this and this, but for like the confidence of results, I think it comes back to that having that like laser focus on this one variable that we're looking to change. Like that's where the value is, and that's where we're really going to be able to like tie everything in.
Got it. And so you mentioned at the beginning like splitting the list in half. Would you recommend to set aside like a number of contacts, do the A/B testing, and then use the like the rest of the list as a control group or something like that, or do it this way, or you just use the whole contact list for the experiment?
Sorry, you briefly cut up in the middle there, so I lost your sound just in the middle there. Okay. Please, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So the question was, if you have this list for the experiment, do you set aside like part of that list so that you can like run the more successful part of the campaign or of the experiment on that excluded part of the list, or you use the whole list for the whole experiment?
I think that's a really good question. I think this is one that comes back to their point about kind of wider business ramifications of how the experiment's being run. Like ultimately, it would be amazing to have a sample size and a list of like 5,000 prospects that we can like prospect to, run the experiment with all of them, and then we can build another list. But like ultimately, that's in a perfect world. I think it depends from your side. Like a couple of questions I'd ask is, how easy do you think it would be to build a further list after the experiment? If you think you could get more contacts, it would be quite straightforward. I would err on the side of putting as many contacts to start with into the experiment.
Okay.
I would equally say that if it is something that you have enough that you feel confident with the test you're running, and for example, I don't know, if really early on you get like really, really compelling results. So I don't know, within a week of running it, you get 10 booked meetings from like LinkedIn and none from email. But in your experiment plan, you said you were going to run it for a month. I mean, again, like business ramifications. I feel like ultimately the goal is to find out what works. It seems quite clear that LinkedIn is working. So I think this is where it comes to like the nuance of the business decision side. So I think that's one that you can definitely change. But if you put all the contacts in and it becomes really obvious that one's performing better, you know what? Like put those contacts that are still cold from one campaign into the other. I think ultimately that's something really important to keep in mind here. Is I keep saying it, and I'm going to keep saying it again because I think it's a really key point. Is yes, we want to stick to a really scientific method so we can be really confident in our results, so we can increase the number of meetings booked. Like that's the ultimate goal of this, right? But if any stage during this process, like there are obvious like business ramifications that are going to be detrimental to sticking to this like really square scientific method, they need to be taken into account as well in the whole picture. It's like context. So that's kind of how I would approach this list side. Obviously, if it's a case of only a few contacts, still really like not really confident on which way it will swing, I would say increase that sample size if you can, if you have the contacts, and if you can carry on building it as later down the line.
And this might be a situation as well where you might need to pull upwards a little bit and take a look around and say, do we need to do a market fit first? What's working in the Czech Republic might work with messaging in the new market. So if you're looking to break into the United States, you might want to create a hypothesis around A/B testing messaging that's successful in the Czech Republic. Is it successful in the States? It might be a situation where your hypothesis is, let's just open a dialogue, depending on timelines and resources, of course, internally. Do we want to run this experiment as a way to do a market fit to see where people are even at? Of course, the end goal is booking meetings, but do we need to take a bit of a high level approach and say, let's open the conversation and we can nurture those leads down the road to booking meetings, but we just need to understand the market to begin with. And that's something that, although it can be a bit time consuming and it doesn't necessarily convert everything to a meeting, it might in the long run save you time with getting on calls that are just not the right fit to begin with. Again, of course, internal resources can be a sticking point here, but perhaps your initial hypothesis is simply, let's just test the market and see what people are looking for and where their pain points are sitting. And then you continue to A/B test from there, and those conversations naturally will generate meetings. But again, it depends on your timeline of how quickly you're looking to book these calls.
Right. And so you mentioned it before. So the time frame for the experiment is, I guess, like 1 month or something like that, of that sort. Is it what you run internally for that period of time, or do you do it quicker? Or?
So we'll typically run experiments over the course of a month.
Okay.
What's more important than time, though, is sample size. So a month we kind of set on just because it gave us the right amount of time to reach a sample size we were comfortable enough, which was around the 2,000 contacts mark. So if you have a smaller sample size, it can run shorter. I think the time element is somewhat arbitrary, but it's linked to how quickly you can get up to those contacts. So I don't know if you could reach all the contacts, I don't know, in like 3 or 4 days, then there's no reason why it has to be like longer than that. Obviously, there will be like the follow-ups, and obviously the booking the meetings and managing the conversations wherever they go. So we'll see that's going to kind of like roll on a bit. But when it comes to the actual sending out the initials or those invites on LinkedIn, I think the timeline is more tied to like how many people you're reaching or how many people you can reach in a designated time.
See. All right.
Perfect. So I mean, I feel like they're the key points around the design side. I mean, Peter, how are you feeling at the moment about kind of what we've spoken through so far, and kind of about approaching it and what you're going to be doing?
I mean, yeah, the first thing is we will definitely take the messaging we used here in Czech Republic, and we'll do like the first test will be if people will respond to the messaging we used in Czech Republic, obviously translated into English, but then we will see if the like product market fit is there or not. And for this, I will need to, it will be quite straightforward. The first thing which will be very important is building the list. So for this experiment as a whole. But yeah, so far I understood very good. One question though, when you start this experiment, how do you track the progress?
Oh, well, this takes me back to Ferrari. Oh, can I?
Back to the good old days.
So we have the actual experiment itself. We use this experiment doc template. I will share it with you afterwards, and also anyone else who is listening along and wants access to this. We'll make sure to share it with everyone who's involved, just so you can spend a bit of time going through this and kind of maybe use it internally, if that would be useful for you. So this is the way to kind of track like the experiment design, kind of the thought behind the experiment, why you want to do it, kind of all that side of things. For the actual tracking of the results, so we lucky we had an internal email platform that we used a lot, and that was a good way of tracking results. There are also, I know in Outreach, they have you can set up 2 separate campaigns and then track kind of positives and how many people you've reached to, and where each of your each of your prospects are in the sequence. Patricia, I know you've been working a lot with Outreach. Would that be a good way to do it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely something you can do, and it will track, your touch points and whatnot.
Yeah, perfect. And then
does it work even for LinkedIn messaging?
You can build tasks into your sequences. The examples I have at the moment are working with an SDR who builds this into their cadences. So they use LinkedIn as a touch point. It's different than what we're discussing here, simply the nature of how these messages are laid out. But for us, it's something that we build into our sequences to ensure we have a multi-touch sequence for our teams.
I see. Got it.
And then
and just jumping in, I'm going to throw a link in the chat in the YouTube chat here. So if anybody's curious about wants a copy of this, I've got a shared Google Doc that you can download, and I think it's got all the questions. I'm just verifying, but if it doesn't, I'll get Lavinia to copy paste in. It's slightly different, but it's very, very similar. Yeah. Cool. So I threw that in, and then Peter, I threw in the chat, in the Zoom chat and in the YouTube chat, a guy that we used to work with on Upwork. I threw a link to his profile on Upwork. So if you're looking for help building that list, his name's Kumar, or he goes by Kumar. It's Pankaj Kumar, but he's in there as ExpressWeb or something like that. So the link is there in both the Zoom for Peter and in the YouTube for anybody that's interested. He did tons of work for us, and was, and I think he did a pretty good job. There's always going to be problems and challenges with List, so nothing is ever perfect. But Pankaj or Kumar did a really great job for us. And sorry, back to you, Lavinia.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's with the doc. Yeah. Also, any questions? If anyone has anything when they're looking through it or working through it, put me an email. It's lavinia@predictablerevenue.com. Easy to work out. Or hit me up on LinkedIn as well. I'm more than happy to kind of go through this and talk anyone through it if there's any uncertainties or if you have any questions. Perfect. So yeah. So back to the tracking platforms, kind of Outreach specific, but honestly, depending on your sample size and depending exactly kind of what is your ultimate measurement. So here, if we're looking ultimately we're looking at how many meetings you can book through each channel. So that's going to be your key metric, your overarching metrics that you want to be focused on. Some of the metrics that we always looked at as well were things like positive response rate. Even though it's not a key metric and it's not meetings booked, it's a good indicator that you're making progress in the right direction. So a positive response can classify from anything. Oh, I'm referring you to this person who is in charge of this area. So you know, okay, great. Like I may not have hit gold first, but they think it's legitimate enough, and they think it's worthy enough to forward on to the right person. Now I know I'm speaking to the right person. Another positive response would be yes, I'm interested, like in the classic, like yes, I'm interested, and then when it converts to that actual booked meeting, they're also responses that will measure as prerequisites. And I think also negative responses are kind of good to keep track of, just because again it comes back to that idea that no difference in results is still a good result. Like if you get negative responses for whatever rhyme or reason, maybe they're saying this isn't a fit, this isn't relevant, but or we're using another solution, whatever it may be, I think that's still super valuable to track as well. And I think a lot of this can be done kind of manually, just like tracked in a sheet. Granted, it's not ideal, but I think it's the easiest, quickest, kind of like most low cost way just to keep an idea of what's going on. I think there will be some other solutions, like Outreach and others that you can kind of classify and keep everything like in a dashboard. But ultimately, one of the aims is to get this together like as quickly, low cost as possible, hash things out, try things out, and then see what happens. And then if there is a compelling reason, like, okay, this is really good, we're going to keep doing this, keep moving forward, then it's time to like look at those resources and how can we put in other resources to this. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah, thank you.
Sounds good. So yeah, so we've got the setup, got the design, got the idea, kind of we know what we're going to do. Now it's the doing it. I mean, I feel like this is where perfect preparation prevents poor performance. So I feel like
say that 5 times fast.
Exactly. It's so that's a case of like getting out there, building that list, sending out those messages, kind of getting that to sample size, tracking those results, and then whether it's a month, whether it's a week, depending on what time of sample size you'll start looking at the results and kind of start trying to get some like analysis on it. I think this when it comes to your point about time as well, obviously there are some people that might reply to a campaign like in 6 months. I don't know, definitely as an AS, every now and again there would be someone that would reply to an email 6 months along the line being like, yeah, I'm interested, can we set up a call? You're like, where did that come from? Like,
how was that unread for so long?
Yeah, exactly. So obviously when it comes to these experiments, you have to put some kind of time on it with regards to like what the results are going to measure. So again, I think that's up to you, kind of what makes the most sense in the context. Are you really looking for kind of booking those meetings sooner rather than later? I think most people would be. So kind of putting a limit, saying, when that last cohort of prospects who have had the last follow-up sent to them, that would be a good way to do a cutoff date. Then all those messages have gone out, all the follow-ups have gone out, so you're kind of like through all your sequences. I think that would be a good way to start and like have some kind of definitive end. Otherwise, you could just keep going and going. And this is where you start to think about kind of what happened. So on the experiment template, it's kind of what were the results ultimately? So looking at kind of documenting for each the control and experimental campaign, how many initials or LinkedIn invites, initial emails or LinkedIn invites did you send? And also like how many meetings booked, kind of what conversion rate is that, what percentage? And then you can also kind of put some sub elements of kind of like we were saying, like the positive responses, the negative responses. And I think this bit where you can add a bit more color around it. Any observations during the process. So I think that's a good point as well. I think it's with each experiment, it's probably best to have one person kind of managing both of them for each experiment, because then they're more likely to see any trends or anything that's going on. Whereas if you have maybe one person running the experiment and one person running the control, it might not be as like clear cut, because obviously they have kind of like a siloed view. But if you have them like doing both, this is where they can come in what happened, and they say, oh, I noticed that on LinkedIn, the objections were this specific, whereas in email they were different. And then that, for example, would like throw up a different question of like, okay, why is that? What can we start looking at? Okay, and then you go back to the beginning of your process, like, why is this important? How can we test it? What problem is this like focusing on? And then you go all the way through again. So I think that's important, and kind of look at the other elements of like running the campaign. So again, the last three areas we have on the experiment doc template is like, how much time did this take? I think that's really crucial. It comes back to like the business ramifications of testing. Was like, did it take a long time to set up? Did it take a long time to manage the responses? Did it take a long time to list build? Like whatever it was, it's really key, because if it's like, okay, I had really great results, but it took my SDRs like 3 days to list build, and then it took them 3 days to get everything set up, send invites, you're like, okay, well, there's clearly something we need to like adjust here before we can like adapt this or like adopt this as a strategy. So that's something really interesting to think about. And then think about like, why did it take so much time? How could we cut down the time if we try to do this again? Lots of different questions that just start you thinking about like the impacts and what impact this is going to have like on your outbound strategy. And then limitations and risks. This is kind of the critical analysis side as well. I think it's really important like to understand kind of what we're doing, and kind of it's so easy to get excited and carried away when you get something that works. Like, damn, yes, I'm going to go and do this. This is going to be the money maker. I'm going to get all my results. Like, go for it. And then because you're so excited, then kind of blind to other areas. So limitations and risk. It's like as the kind of the leading questions are there. Like, what are the limitations being rolled out of multiple campaigns? What are the limitations of this potentially being scaled? Were they factors that you can control? If you can control them, kind of like how could you improve them? If you can't, is there anything else you can do to kind of like negate like external limitations? And also risks. I think there are like inherent risks with kind of reaching out to people externally. I mean, perfect examples are data protection laws like GDPR, can spam, all of that side of things. Like there could have been certain methods before that they would make basically redundant. You can't do it. So there are some always going to be some risks, and I think this is like risks. You're trying to think like worst case scenario. I don't know what happened if, obviously it's not going to happen. Like you couldn't leverage LinkedIn as a platform tomorrow. Obviously that would be like pretty critical. But there are like other smaller elements like what happened if my LinkedIn account got shut down and I had to use someone else's. Or it's kind of thinking about these risks. Just I think it's almost like doing that pre-mortem exercise, just so that if anything does come up, you're kind of more prepared, and you almost have like a subconscious plan B if something does go wrong.
We spend a lot of time in brainstorming doing that pre-mortem. We sit down and say, what are all of the potential fallouts from this, or what are our potential barriers? That way, hopefully, if something does happen to appear, we've already at least had it on the table for discussion.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, and then I think what next? Once going through all that experiment phase, kind of the design, like going from the what's our problem that we want to solve through to having the results. Then obviously we're looking at what do those results mean? Like, is there statistical significance? And I think that's super important, but I also think it comes back to that like business ramification, practical application side. Like statisticians are like a whole different subset. Like they understand so much, like it's so technical, and I don't think there's any expectation that that's going to be directly applied for what we're doing, because I think it's like so complicated. Like, God, I don't understand it. I did maths up until like GCSE like 16. Like that's the level of stats I did. So
I don't want to tell you how I passed my stats course in uni. I wrote an essay as an art student, and they passed me.
I think I did some in like social sciences at university, but I mean my proper stats is like limited. So like don't get caught up in that. There are like tools online that you can punch stuff in when you set your p-value, and then it kind of throws it out for you depending on like your variables. But also, again, I think it's business ramifications, right? Like statistical significance is important, but business, gosh, I'm getting tongue-tied now, but business significance is more important.
100%. Like, I'll just jump in to sort of help Lavinia here. Because one thing to remember is we're not trying to get these results published in Science. We're trying to learn something. And so we're not going to go, like, we're not doing, like, most of these, hopefully we can get to a certain level of statistical significance. But to get to like proper, if we were going to publish this as a proper paper, there's so much more due diligence that we'd have to do. There's so many more variables that we'd have to control. And it's just impractical to get to that level. It's possible, but you'd spend a year designing, or maybe not a year, you'd spend a couple months designing an experiment. You'd run it for 6 weeks and hopefully, be able to achieve all those variables. But it's just not worth it to invest that amount of time in a single experiment. There might be some in your company's history where you're like, hey, we need to understand definitively one way or the other. Is it X or is it Y? And you know what? That might be an opportunity to jump in for something like that. But for the most part, what we're looking to provide you with here is just a lens through which you can think of your experiments. And so we're hoping to get from basically going from random testing of just like changing one thing in an email template to being a little bit more methodical about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, it all comes back to that confidence. I think I definitely did it as an AS, you kind of tweak little things and then you see your results go up, but because you've changed so many different things, you don't really know what's going on. But this shines a bit more light and gives transparency. So you can confidently say, okay, I've controlled variables as far as I possibly can, and I changed this one variable, so my channel, I changed LinkedIn, and this is what happened to my results. So my confidence there is going to be way higher that it's the channel that's making the difference there. So I think, yeah, when it comes to what next, exactly what Colin was saying, like we're looking to help improve strategies, get results, and then it's going to throw up loads more questions like we were saying earlier. So Peter, to your point, okay, it's a new market, so we're looking at channel here, but now we might want to look at like locality. We want to look at the value prop you're using in your messaging. The results of each of the experiments are going to feed back to inform like kind of your next experiment and how you design that next experiment. So you're going to keep going in this loop. So you like constantly have this breaking into a new market. So it's going to be channel. Okay, now I understand this about channel. I'm going to go back and look at, for example, my value prop that I'm going to use on LinkedIn. And then on LinkedIn, that's going to be my variable, the value prop. And then you may do that experiment and you may say, well, either there wasn't that much difference, I booked about the same amount of meetings, or I didn't book any meetings. But also I think that's crucial. That's not like a failed experiment. You still have a result. That result is still as legitimate as if you have booked 10 meetings from each. But it's just different. So you might say, okay, what do I think it was? And that's when you go back to the beginning. Okay, my problem is I don't understand why this channel working. So it's this whole cycle of kind of like experimenting results, and then it like feeds you on. So it's like it should be a whole system. And then I know internally it's definitely like it becomes more of a habit, like thinking of what we're testing this way and like taking this approach.
Perfect. Well said. Well said. I want to make sure that before we forget everybody, that I've thrown it in chat a couple times, but we do have an opportunity to win a couple of books. And so any subscribers to the channel will get entered into a draw. We're going to throw a couple books in there. And so make sure this is your opportunity to do that now. And anybody that subscribes this week, I think we're going to do the draw tomorrow. I think that's what Julia said. And if that's not what Julia said, well, then I'm lying, and she might have to give away a couple extra books. But if you do end up winning and you already have a copy of PR of Predictable Revenue, then let us know and we'll get you a copy of Impossible to Inevitable instead. And because I see there was a couple people there. And so thanks for hanging out. I know we want to make sure we leave some time for questions. And so let's jump in. If you're in the chat, if you're hanging out, what questions do you have? I know there's been lots along the way. But if you got any questions, let's jump in. And so throw it in there. And what I'm going to do is just, Lavinia, if you could kill your screen, let's just jump back to, there we go. Oh, moving around here. Let me get back to OBS. Nope, that one. There we go. Cool. All right, so we've got a couple questions from both people in the chat here. Not both people, from both sources, people in the chat and from people in from the newsletter. And so we're going to start with some of the people in the newsletter, and then if you're in the chat, throw your questions there, and we will get to you shortly. So I apologize for all of the terrible pronunciations of names. I will do my best, but I make no promises that my best is any good. All right, so Carlos, I'm going to guess Yamarillo, is asking about setting up experiments for intangible products like financial services funds. So how do I go about that if I'm not selling a physical product?
I think it's exactly the same. I think if it's tangible or intangible, I think the process of setting up the campaigns, getting those experiments going, the approach campaigns, is exactly the same. I don't think there should be too much nuance. I think ultimately it's looking, test what works. Again, channels, value prop, messaging. I think it's all it should be exactly the same approach.
Perfect. Totally agree.
What sticks out there for me is like testing pain points for services is a big one. If it's not an actual product, testing those pain points is a good suggestion.
Because it doesn't matter if it's physical or digital or a service that's delivered by people. It's all about the value that we're selling. And so we really shouldn't be talking about the actual details of the product or service. We should be talking about the value that it can create.
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. All right. Laxman Papanini. I apologize. That's a horrible pronunciation of a pretty great name. How do you keep track of experiments? Well, my friend, we covered that a little bit earlier. I'm going to throw a link here for you. And we're going to call that one mixed. But if you missed it and you're listening, there's an experiment template. We talked about it for about 10 minutes, about 15 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago. I also threw a link in the chat if you want to see a copy of the doc that we use. All right, I'm going to go back to YouTube here. Mark, reporting seamlessly across LinkedIn and Drip, I find it hard. I basically do it in HubSpot once the lead is qualified. Yeah, that's a tough one. There are some tools like Phantom Buster helps you pull stuff out and into a spreadsheet, so that can help you keep track. And what you can do is just like use that to pull like a raw conversations report, and then you can do some searches and things like that. But it does get kind of challenging. There are tools out there. I don't recommend them because they're not compliant with LinkedIn's terms of service. So it's probably best to get something like an Upworker or a junior team member, or build yourself your own LinkedIn research department. Jermaine, I got that one. I'm pretty sure I got that one. I'm like 80%, 90% confident I got that name right. How do you test the existence of God? Market demand. Sorry, for a new product that you sell in a whole new market segments where you have no existing relationships with the people you're reaching out to. This sounds like OV. Lavinia?
I'm gonna say bang. Yes, it's a big one. And I think it goes back to what we were saying about there are so many different things we want to test because there are so many uncertainties. But I think again, it's like breaking them down into each uncertainty. So we're looking at specific personas and specific messaging for those personas, and then creating lots of different tests around each of those different personas and messages with that particular value prop. And then I think kind of like running them side by side and measuring them. It's a tough gig, definitely, because like you've got so much testing to do, and like when everything's in front of you, you could it's so easy to get overwhelmed. But I think this is a really good way to approach it and just like break it down into bite-sized pieces. Test one thing at a time, because as soon as you start muddying the water, that's when it's going to get like really out of control. You don't know what's happening, like what's impacting what. So I think just like break it down really bite-sized chunks. I think I were talking about with Peter, it's a whole new market. Okay, first test, what do you want to test first? Channel. Then what do you want to test? Okay, this area. And then kind of keep doing that individually, and then keep looping back. Okay, what are we going to test now? And with like knowing what we now know, what we do it. But I think it's the classic like small easy iterations is definitely going to help you make progress rather than trying to take on everything at once.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like with a new market, testing what you know can help as well. If you know what you excel at, you know what you're really good at, and you know what you have to offer, start there and see what feedback you're getting. Start with what you know, and start with the personas that you know you're already dealing with. That can be helpful too, to glean information, and then you slowly work your way out of that. But to dunk your head underwater completely blind might not be the best way to start a test. It might be, where you end up in that water down the line, but start with what you know.
100%. I'm trying to find a talk that we did at SaaStock. If I can't, I'll find the notes. But anyway, one of my favorite pieces that came out of our outbound validation program, and I threw a link there. I think it was Kenny's article on why you should validate your outbound strategy. And so, Jermaine, I think that'll be a helpful one. And have a look at some of our. Here, I'll throw a general link. I think this might be. Oh, hang on a sec. Wrong hotkey. I'm going to throw a link in the chat here for you. So there's another one that might lead you to some like more salesy content than you're looking for, but I think there is some good stuff in terms of, there should be a couple links in terms of some more of the theory. I'm just trying to find it. But basically, yeah. One of my favorite pieces that came out of that program is like doing a really smart job of segmenting your markets. And if you do some searching for Kenny's chains of relevant stuff, I'll try and track down that article. I think it's linked in one of those two docs, but I'm not 100% sure. But my favorite thing is once you've really drilled in and broken apart your markets, going at them with a message around that's sort of focused on not on the value prop, and not on the product that you're offering, but actually saying, hey, is this relevant to you? Hey, I noticed that you're VP of marketing in this sort of space. Are you dealing with X problem right now? Really, really soft ask. If you're trying to validate, test, and learn, asking them for feedback, asking them, is this relevant, are things that are exceptionally helpful, because it's designed to elicit responses. And so even if your targeting is way off and the individuals are like, nah, not really something that I want, they're going to tell you. And so when you write the messaging in a softer way, it's gonna help you learn quite a bit more. So that'd be my recommendation to you.
The human element is key there, to resonate with what people are dealing with on a daily basis to get their job done.
Totally. All right, let's go back to questions from the newsletter. John Zarinow. John, I'm sorry now about how I pronounce that. I'm a dad. I couldn't resist. What's the minimum sample size to analyze the effectiveness of a messaging campaign?
I think ideally about 2,000 total, 2,000 contacts. I mean, that obviously depending on what market you're targeting, that could either be a small fraction of your total market, or that could be like 10 times the size of your actual market. So again, it like comes into at what point would you feel confident with the results, and what is reasonable number of contacts to be sampling. I think very, very kind of like minimum, we're looking at kind of 100, 200 per campaign, I would say, like as a starting point. I think anything lower than that, you're really, really putting yourself at risk of sampling error. And again, and it comes down to that, like weighing up the pros and cons, right? If it's going to be like a huge drain on resources, a lot of time and effort to build a larger list, then, stop at the smaller size. But ultimately, if you want to use this experiment and the results of the experiment to guide your outbound strategy, there does need to be a certain element of investment at the beginning of the process to make those results worthwhile. Because if you use like 10 people per experiment and get to the end, like you're going to have no confidence in that. Ultimately, you would be better like investing that time at the beginning. So I think perfect worlds at 2,000 contacts, 2,000 prospects. But ultimately, it obviously depends on the situation, and just thinking about that end result.
Totally. Nick Turnbull had a question from our newsletter, and he was asking something similar, which is, what is the ideal time frame before changing messaging? And I think it's the same answer. It's probably 150 to 250 contacts that have been exposed to that campaign, that variation of the messaging, before you want to make a change there. So we've got one more. We've got another one from Lauren Stern. What type of experiments are you doing, and what technology are you using? We are experimenting on anything from targeting, messaging, channels, and we've even done technology experiments. And then what tech are we using right now? We're using tools like Outreach and SalesLoft, ZoomInfo for data, LinkedIn, Sales Navigator. And then Google Sheets and Google Docs to manage the experiment experiments and templates. And I think that's the most important piece is if you're running a multiple experiments, making sure that you have a place for tracking them. I think that's more important than any tool. All right, I'm gonna do another double check here. We got a couple in YouTube here. We got Woolulu. I'm really hoping that's an Age of Empires reference, but maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What is a successful positive reply rate?
Oof. Good question. I mean, Patricia, you're more on the front line, kind of on that side of things than I am at the moment. Kind of what are the trends at the moment?
You know, what's funny is that asked me 6 months ago, I would have had a different answer than I do today, simply because the market has shifted so much and the environment has shifted so much with COVID. I think we'd be remiss to not bring that up at some point.
What's this COVID that you speak of?
Oh, you haven't heard of it? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
Cool. I'll send you a link.
I missed that. Yeah, interesting.
Our government has sent out some guidelines. I'll send you.
Oh yeah.
So previously, I would have said, you know, our open rates, if you will, response rates via LinkedIn would have been a really great indicator of the success of what we're looking for. Now that a lot of people have moved remotely, we're seeing our open rates on email increase drastically. There's probably multiple factors there that it's going to take months to kind of digest that information. Of course, people are still responding on LinkedIn. This is a tricky one to answer simply because sample size is key here. Demographic, your persona is key. There are certain personas that love to open and answer emails, certain personas that avoid communication at all costs. And that's a wide strokes of sort of suggestion, but you can see in certain personas that are variable for what we see as a positive, open rate, a good open rate is different depending on the persona you're targeting. So I would want to drill down into that a little bit more to look at who you're actually targeting and prospecting. So that one's a bit, to give a hard number is tricky. But I would say that you really have to look at the communication style of who you're engaging with, for sure.
A good way to sometimes kind of ballpark a figure as well could be to work backwards as well. So like ultimately, what is your kind of like monthly target, weekly target, and then kind of work backwards. If you want to book X number of meetings in this month, that's your target. Then kind of what do you like, how many positive responses do you need? And then like compare that to your sample size. So if your monthly target is 10 meetings and you're sending 100 emails a month, then kind of like look at that thinking, okay, that means like literally 10% of the people I'm responding to. That's going to be a huge conversion rate, and kind of like work backwards and kind of break it down and kind of look at what you feel is like realistic. Because I think that's a big thing as well. Like if you don't have anything like hard and fast to go on, like your gut is going to tell you that a 10% conversion rate is like it's going to be pretty great if you hit that. Mm-hmm. So kind of like work backwards can be a way to start with some number.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Jermaine's tossing us a softball. Will there be a YouTube video rerun after the stream is posted on the channel and it's over? I just tuned in and asked the previous question. Yes, but only if you subscribe and hit the bell notification icon. There's a secret setting in YouTube that allows me to hide videos from you. No, I'm just kidding. But it'd be super helpful if you do, because it'll ping you a notification when it goes live. So if you're curious, yeah, you can. It'll be up on our channel. GVMC-C asked, is there an actual book or we can purchase hardcover or ebook? Yes, there is. I believe we even have audiobooks. I threw the links in the chat so you can check them out there. Woolulu, let me know. Is your name there? Is that an Age of Empires reference, or am I just, or is that like a nickname or anything? Anyway, back to questions from the newsletter. How has COVID changed how you're testing messaging? From Guan White. Again, I'm butchering names. I apologize.
That's a big one. I'm happy to try to tackle that. I feel like we could spend an hour talking about that in general. Mm-hmm. It requires regular regulation, if you will. So at the beginning of the pandemic, ensuring that we were addressing that it was happening, that there was uncertainty going on. At some point, we realized, people are kind of sick of hearing a certain style of messaging. You pivot again. You test messaging associated with, is this remote work we're talking about? The industry you're working about is key as well. If you're working in something, say, like supply chain, things are wild in supply chain right now. So are you looking to build more of a nurture test to see, okay, right now is not a great buying cycle for people because the house is on fire. So then do we work on trying to leave room for conversations down the road when people have a better understanding of what their industry looks like. So COVID, it's offered an opportunity for us to learn a lot and actually engage in some very meaningful conversations with people. You know, even when you're getting responses from people that say, I've been furloughed, I can't talk to you about this right now, having the human compassion to engage with those people and say, I'm really sorry this has happened to you. Do you want to have a conversation around what that looks like for you? That gives you an opportunity to understand what's happening in the demographic of people that you're looking to target, and helps you understand perhaps, you know, what your product or solution has to offer someone in a situation like this where there's so many variables at play. This is where a lot of conversation and listening happens, and ensuring you have boots on the ground with people to understand what you actually need to test moving forward, and being open to flexibility down the road. What works today, 3 months from now, as we've seen, it's a completely different environment that you're looking at. So being flexible, and in this situation, probably putting a lot of energy into how you're structuring your messages and your experiments to ensure that you're getting as much information as you can from those that are engaging with you.
Great answer. Great answer. We had something similar from Rick Cates as well, basically asking, what are your thoughts on COVID fatigue and people tuning out of like COVID specific messages?
It's a thing. Of course, with respect to the fact that it's also not wise to completely ignore the fact that it's happening, especially if there's an industry being heavily impacted by it. There are some clients, you know, that you see where their solution actually is really helpful in this situation. So you want to present this to someone as like, we want to understand what your needs are right now. But of course, you don't want to beat a dead horse either, for lack of a better word. You know, you don't want to overkill on something that people are going, I'm sick of being reminded that this isn't great.
I think, can I sum it up and say you have to understand that COVID is happening, but you don't necessarily have to call it out in the first line of the email, right? And so what you want to be making sure you're doing is changing and modifying your message to empathize with the situation, even if you're not specifically saying COVID, COVID, COVID.
And subject lines here are a great test. Do you want every email in your inbox to have COVID-19 on it? Maybe, maybe not. It's a test you can run.
No, definitely not. All right, we got a couple more. I'm going to double check YouTube here. Woolulu, it's a King of the Hill reference. I'll have to check that out. Ben Harbert, 10% is doable using LinkedIn posts as the premise, much smaller batches, 10 to 60 people. But for some businesses, that's plenty if a couple go out each week. Oh, no question mark there. GVMC saying, you're all doing a great job. Oh, well, thanks. Thanks, friend. All right, so I've got a couple in the live stream, from the newsletter. We've got Naveen Konaru. I'm like 40% confident I did an acceptable job there. Will this be relevant when we are, and she's got a couple, or they have a couple, will this be relevant when we are in the early stages of setting up teams with a single SDR?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the method we've gone through for approaching testing is relevant if you're like a single founder and you're taking on the hat of sales, operations, all of the above. And it also is relevant, and it applies to if you're an SDR manager and you have a team of like 10 SDRs and everything in between. So yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. And Naveen also had a couple more questions. Are there data points in the presentation, campaign length, calls, conversion metrics?
So we didn't include those largely because we wanted to focus more on the how rather than the what side of things. And also I think when we're testing, like everyone's going to be testing something completely different. Everyone's going to have completely different benchmarks for results. I think a perfect example is I was just saying a 10% conversion rate was crazy. I think Colin read out in the comments, like for some people, like that's their benchmark and that's what they're aiming for. So I think the focus of this was really to look at like how you approach it, and then you go about setting your benchmarks based on like your experience, and like to an extent sometimes your gut, but it's like it's an informed decision, right? You know what your industry is like, you know how well your solution sits in the competitive landscape. I think that all takes into account. So yeah, it's a very, very tailored thing.
And the last question from Naveen, would it be possible to see specific samples of messaging pre and post experiments?
So pre and post experiments, I think the key thing is that you'd start with 2 versions of messaging and test them. And then I think once you've tested those different types, styles of messaging throughout, afterwards, how you tweak that messaging would really depend on kind of what route you want to go down next with regards to what to test. So again, I think that's a very specific, like circumstantial change. But yeah, this is a good kind of loop to test. So you're testing like two different elements, and then you change one at the end and you kind of loop back. So it's a good way to keep iterating that message.
Perfect. I'm going to do one last check in YouTube. If you're hanging out and you got a question, throw it in here and we'll get to it. If not, I've got one more question here from Alex Hobbs. How do I test B2B contact data sources? So if I'm purchasing from different vendors, how do I test quality, overlap, cost effectiveness, value, ROI?
So I think so the first one that comes to mind is testing quality. So I think my big question would be kind of quality of the data, quality when it comes to like the results, like meetings booked, quality when it comes to responses. So I think it's like, again, being like really specific and focusing on like, what is it you want to test? If it's quality with regards to if the emails are accurate, I know there are tools out there that you can get to like look over lists, test them, make sure that there are no traps in there or no expired emails. If it's about quality when it comes to meeting books, I mean, this is a perfect way to do it. Instead of keeping your list as that control variable, that's the one you can change. So you can compare from A, data provider, and B, data provider, keep everything else the same, test again, then you should hopefully get an idea from there.
Cool. Can I add? Basically,
yeah.
Fresh Address is one of the companies that we use to do the test. And then in terms of like the ROI, it's going to really depend on how good of a job you do as, with your outreach. And so are you doing, and it comes back to the experiment design. If you are going after a market where you've had traction with a message that you've had traction, and the only new variable is the list, then you're actually testing just the list. But if you're saying new list, new message, new market, new product, that's just random. And I hear so many people complain about, I bought a list and it was garbage and this and that. It's like, no, the list may or may not have been garbage, but you didn't actually test that. The results you got were bad, but that's not necessarily a reflection of the list. And it very well could have been. If you send 100 emails, you get 100 bounces. Yeah, it was a crappy list. And you probably want to make sure you verify that ahead of time. But yeah, just one thing to keep in mind is we're looking to change only one variable. And if the list is the one variable, make sure everything else is the same. Perfect. We're pretty much at time here. So Patricia, Lavinia, Peter, any last final comments before we call it quits today?
I think just thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone who's tuned in, and Peter as well for being on running an example. super good to have you on the call as well.
I wanted to thank you as well for having me. I'm looking forward to try some of these experiments in the real world.
Yeah, you'll have to keep in touch and let us know how they go.
Definitely.
Please, yeah.
Right on. Cool. Well, thanks to Rebecca, to Lavinia, to Patricia, and to Peter, and to everybody in the chat that hung out with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. And if we missed anything, you've got further questions, if you're watching this later on YouTube as a replay, hit us up on LinkedIn. I threw a few of our LinkedIn profiles in there, or throw a question in the comments, because we've got our team that'll be monitoring those and bubble them up to us and make sure we get you a response. So thanks for tuning in. And Peter, Rebecca, Lavinia, Patricia, thanks for joining us. We'll see y'all next time.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.